So welcome to this week 3 class in which we're going to briefly go through some of the areas to be covered in this subject. We're also going to focus on assignment 2, which will come up, and we'll also mention assignment 1, the forums, and assignment 3, which will follow on from assignment 2. So big thank you for those who've posted in the forums. So in this subject, we're teaching critical thinking skills, which are essential for you in your study in every subject that you do at university level. And also they're essential for the children that you teach, in that we want them to develop skills to think well. Interestingly, parents or people in charge don't always necessarily want lots of critical thinking. They might want just silent obedience. But that's one of the challenges that people face in critical thinking and addressing the question of truth. In some ways, this course is not like some of the other subjects studied, in that it's not so much content as how to think, though I think every subject is about how to do their subject, and every subject involves some level of critical thinking. In the student handout, you'll find a lot of information about the subject and what is going to be covered. We have also a textbook that gives some great resources on critical thinking. So I encourage you, you might want to go to that textbook, and it's got some great ideas. If you go to Google Scholar as well, you'll see that there are some very valuable resources as well. And even Google, though Google won't have the academic reliability of Google Scholar. So this critical thinking textbook gives you some insights into critical thinking, and it's similar to many of the books that you get from the college library. Why should we be critical thinkers? What's the advantage of that? How do we think logically? And deductive means we go down from the general principle, we test it. Discussion of truth, what is truth? And this is often called philosophy. And there's a link between philosophy and theology and Christian belief as well. Then we look at clarity, and we also look at how we know what is truth. We can also look at rhetoric. That is, people will often use the way they say things and arguments to convince truth. And so that's a useful resource that you could go to as well. And there's lots of other resources that we could include, but that's just one that we include. Some of the other resources are Greg Bassam's Critical Thinking Student Introduction and Matthew Van Cleve's Introduction to Logic and Critical Thinking. Each week we have some readings. There's usually one main reading that you're asked to comment in the forum post. And so in the first week, there's some great comments on thinking and the way it helps students. And thank you for those very valuable, useful comments. And then there's a couple of other resources as well that you can read. In week 2, students really enjoyed, I think, The Allegory of the Cave by Plato. And there's lots of ways we can look further into Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle's fascinating in that we can still read a lot of Aristotle's writings today. So if you were to write Aristotle writing online, you could look them up, and you could still read them online today, and they would be quite fascinating. They still have a lot of value to us. And so I encourage you to consider that. So Project Gutenberg has got some of the writings of Aristotle, and the Internet Classics Archive has also got some of the writings of Aristotle. So he's written on ethics, he's written on politics, and a number of other subjects. So you could actually look these up and read them. And so Internet Classic Archive as well has got a number of his writings on memory. Metaphysics, I think, is particularly important. And so we could read Aristotle's writings on metaphysics. And it's amazing that they still stand the time after all these years. And books on mathematics written by the ancient Greeks and a number of other books written by the ancient Greeks are fascinating. I know one of my family members became a bit unwell, and I looked up Galem's 2,000-year-old medical encyclopedia and said, these are some great insights. And my family said, 2,000-year-old Dad, this is a bit out of date. But it is amazing, the sort of writings that we have from 2,000 years ago. And here's Aristotle's writings, 350 BC, from the ancient Greeks. And just the writing style, I think, is amazing. It doesn't have all the references necessarily that we have today in our modern writing style, but it is quite amazing. So I encourage you, enjoy week 2, where we look at the various Greeks and others there. And then we've got the readings for week 2. I do encourage some of these encyclopedias, like the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy and others. And so there's quite a good resource there. And also the Stanford Encyclopedia, I think, is even better. And so the Stanford Encyclopedia, you've got the citation over at the side, and you could look up, so Michael Landsberg, 2023, wrote this article on truth. So one of the students was asking before, what is truth? Well, here we got about 20 pages on what truth is. So just a nice read before before you go to bed. And even if you don't understand what truth is, it'll help put you to sleep, and that'll be nice as well. And I mean, you might dream about it while you sleep. Who knows what you could wake up thinking. So there's some great insights here on different theories of truth, and it's worth a bit of a read through. Sometimes we do sort of a skim read through as well. And if you find it hard work, you could always try YouTube. And you could put philosophy of what is truth, philosophy of what is truth, and you could put ancient Greeks as well. And if you put that into YouTube, then you'll find that there's quite a number of resources. Here's a 30-minute resource on what is truth. And if you find it hard to read, then you could watch a philosopher talk about what is truth in the YouTube resource. So there's plenty of info out there on what is truth as well. So I encourage you with that as well. So then this week we've gone on to Christian perspectives on truth. And so I encourage you to explore the Christian perspectives. And then next week we go on to historical perspectives, and then we go on to maths and science perspectives. And each week we cover the 12 perspectives that we're looking at in this subject. So I encourage you to work your way through those as we go through each week. Then after week 5, we do maths and science and observable evidence-based. Week 6, we do science in greater depth. And then week 7, we have a bit of a turn in the subject where we look at language and literature and storytelling. And when you do your third assignment, many cultures focus not so much on the scientific measurement of Western nations like Germany and Britain, America and Australia, but they look more at telling a story. And this is another way of communicating truth. Beth, do you have some thoughts on why is storytelling seen as an equally valid way of telling truth than our scientific, evidence-based, Western last 300 years, measure everything way of measuring truth. And then someone else might have a suggestion after Beth. But do you have any thoughts, Beth?
Um, Maybe because I guess we think in our sort of literal evidence-based mindset, where in their culture, that's not something they value. So for it to be just as important, I guess, yeah, like it doesn't, that's part of who they are. That's how they kind of communicate their truths with story. It's very memorable. It's something that they can relate to. It's part of like who they are and how they teach, I guess, and remember things.
And
So,
this becomes
yeah.
very important in the classroom in that you have some students who fit in very well to the Western worldview of this modernist view. So this is the modern way of viewing the world, that you measure it, that you observe it, etc. But this really contrasts with other cultures that might have a storytelling approach to truth. And this is particularly the case of First Nations people. And there can be a real cultural clash as teachers and students if we're not aware of that. And so our enthusiasm for the Western way of communicating may fail to communicate to uh, other cultures that are in our class, such as First Nation students. And so you wrestle with that in assignment 3, these different ways of approaching truth. So imagine if boy meets girl, girl meets boy, and they use a Western modern way of describing what's happening. Good day, girl. There are hormones moving in my bloodstream that are drawing me to you. So let's go on a date. I mean, is that going to sort of sell it? Or are you better to tell a story? When I first saw you, something moved within me. I mean, that's not scientific. And so our world is, and music. Can you just write a modern measured song? Or and so life is not just about the modern measured, I think would be the case. And even if you meet a doctor who you go in there with you've had an injury, and the doctor says, we will now measure what is happening with your blood pressure, and then we'll move on to, I mean, that really is not human relationship, is it? So there's some things that we can explore. Anyone else got some other thoughts on why we are moving on in week 7 to the humanities and other ways of describing reality? And then we move on to emotion, and we move on to ethics, and then week 10 we move on to cultural different ways. Any hands going up? Sophie, do you have any thoughts? Oh yes, Evelyn, I saw that hand.
Well, yeah, I was just thinking about with storytelling, um, the way that stories maybe in some cultures are created and synthesized. It might just be a case of collective knowledge that has been gained through experience of past generations. So, in that respect, maybe it's kind of not too far off from the scientific method in that it's still gathered by observation, but just transmitted orally, and maybe a more, I don't know, maybe the meaning behind it has been distilled through mythologies, like in the case of First Nations kind of Dreamtime stories. But maybe it is still a way of communicating observation that's just been gathered through generations.
And we see that in the week 3 class on Christian approaches. And so as we look at, say, biblical approaches to how we understand truth before we move on to the teaching methods of Jesus, in the Old Testament, we begin with narratives such as the Abraham narrative. He's moving towards the promised land. He has faith in God. And then we have the Joseph narrative, and then we have the Moses narrative. So this is ways of preserving and communicating truth from the time of Moses, 1400 BC, through to the time of King David, 1000 BC, through to the time of the prophets. But at the same time, we have Proverbs, which are almost a little bit like just statements of truth. And so you got these different ways of communicating truth in this what was an Eastern collection of writings, as opposed to, say, the First Nations collection of their stories. And so you have these different ways of collecting truth. But then right in the midst of that, in the New Testament, we then have the Gospels, where there's a person who is the presence of God comes amongst us in Jesus, and you have something that's almost biographical, in that you have the narrative Jesus and then you have the teachings of Jesus. And that's what we focus a bit on there in week 3. So that's quite interesting as well. Tara, do you have thoughts on how the Christian approaches to truth then stands alongside the Greek approaches to truth and the First Nations Aboriginal storytelling approaches to truth, and then the scientist and other approaches to truth, Aristotle and others? Tara, any thoughts?
Oh, it's all just so big and confusing, isn't it? I think overall, I think the thing that from listening to you and Daniel talk was that as much as we desire to know absolute truth, whatever perspective or understanding we come from, it's limited by our own humanness. And so all of them are relevant. The scientific approach needs to be combined, you know, sort of Aristotle's approach with measuring things needs to be combined with Plato's approach of looking behind the physical reality to see what that's modeled on. And same with the Christian belief, we have this understanding that God is true and absolute, but in our own limitedness, our ability to comprehend how big that is always going to be. I've always struggled with this thing. Like, I've never liked this idea that everyone has their own truth, but that the reality is that we all have our own understanding of what is true, if that makes sense. And that understanding of what is true filters into our worldview and how we interact with our class and all of those sorts of things. So I think each of these different theories is valid in its own way. Yeah, so
And I think
don't know if that's a question, but that's sort of where my head's at the moment with these ideas.
I think Luther and Bonhoeffer and others said that in some ways you do have to take responsibility for your own truth, in that you are living in the world, you're living a life, and if you just go along with everyone, and this is why there's a certain amount of individual responsibility that Martin Luther and Dietrich Bonhoeffer and others proclaimed. Individual responsibility is quite important in the pursuit of truth. But at the same time, we've got to recognize, as you said, that we are in cultures and we are in communities, and these tend to shape the way we think. But it doesn't mean that everything's culturally relevant or irrelevant, in that we have a responsibility to measure truth. And so we have in Galileo, who was a mathematician and a maths teacher, who happened to see that there were some telescope lenses for sale and made his own telescope, and then saw that there were moons going around planets. And then he worked out that probably the Earth goes around the sun and not vice versa. So he wrote a book on it. And he begins his book by saying, we've got to acknowledge God has made the world in a certain way, but when I look through a telescope, it seems to me the Earth goes around the sun. However, he was about 10 or 20 or 25 years off putting the evidence together. So he really didn't have the evidence that was needed. And so I think that was there was not sufficient evidence in his writings. And it was when Newton comes along, say 20, 25 years later, that the evidence is there, and that then we know that the Earth goes around the sun, etc. But so I think as an individual, you've got to speak up, But if you do speak up, you can get into trouble. And that's a challenge in schools too, isn't it? They do things in a certain way, and the person in charge says this is how it's done in our school. And then you got to go along with that and bite your tongue a little bit. But at the same time, truth is important, as assignment 2 discusses, and then as assignment 3 discusses in greater detail. So in assignment 3, you will consider different cultures, and you have to choose one First Nation culture, and it's good to be specific and choose a particular First Nation group in Australia, do some research on that, and then you can choose another culture, and that could be an Asian culture or whatever. And you could also include the Western modern worldview. And really, assignment 2 is looking at your worldview, which I'm assuming is the Western modern worldview. So your worldview is something that you're looking at in assignment 2. And we're assuming that your worldview, because you've been shaped by this European settled group of people here, you've been taught Greek thinking, and you've been raised that way. So assignment 2 is going to cover that sort of material, and there'll be all of those details in assignment 2 on that. So yeah, we'd cover that sort of thing in your second assignment. What influences you? And I think it'd be worth writing a paragraph about the Christian upbringing that you've had, and it would also be worth writing a paragraph about your cultural upbringing and how that will tend to shape your approach and how you will view things. So assignment 2 asks you to look at Peter Vardy's discussion of truth. And I think you could have a couple of sentences on who Peter Vardy is. So there's a little bit of research to see if you can find. So he's written a few books, of which you may be able to identify this one. I assume it may be the one that he wrote on truth, and he's written others on education and teaching. And then you are to reflect on influences that formed your own personal worldview. I think this is an opportunity to look at modernity and modernism and scientificism and all of those things that shape the way we look at the world, that are different to the other cultures that you will look at. And that gives us the benefits of the modern world, but also some of the limitations of our modern approach to truth. And then you're asked to look at some of the syllabus documents, and you could choose your year level, year 2, 3, or prep. And you could say, we think the best way to teach students this way is, and you could look at that. And so if you go to Google Scholar and you were to put in education theories on the best way truth to teach year 2, 3 primary or something like that, you may find that you're able to come up with some theories. Dewey, of course, would be one. Now, you can draw a little bit from other subjects you might study, but you should never be really cutting paste more than, say, the reference and the brief idea. You need to explore it further in this subject. And so you're wanting some theories about teaching of primary education, etc. So that comes from some of the other subjects, perhaps. So there's some areas that you could explore in assignment 2. So you could also look at teaching practice, what you do, how you know that you are doing the right thing, teaching the right way. I would suggest you choose 1, 2, or 3 of these areas, like literacy or special needs, or you could choose values or you could choose behavior management. What you see as the most important aspect of teaching for you, and you want to establish, how do I find out the truth in regards to this approach to teaching that I'm committing to? And we're forever seeking to understand truth about what we do, aren't we? So any questions about assignment 2?
So when you
Beck,
say, oh,
yeah,
sorry.
sorry, go. Yeah,
When
Tara.
we say, how do we understand truth? What we mean is, what is the best way to approach those subjects? For example, if I were to discuss research on explicit teaching for developing phonetic awareness in early childhood, for example, I would talk about the research behind that, what the evidence says, those sorts of things. That's what you mean by truth. How do we establish that that is the best way or the preferred approach?
Yes, I think that's the way you'd do it. You'd mention Peter Vardy and his quote and truth. Then you'd write something about the importance of truth. And then you'd introduce things like evidence-based. And then you would go on to phonetic awareness, early childhood, and evidence. Now, what you're really doing is backward engineering. That is, in your teaching, the most important aspect of truth for you is going to be what you're teaching, such as phonetic awareness in early childhood. And you know that the evidence base is going to be important. And then you step backwards to the previous paragraph, which is, why is evidence-based important rather than hearsay? So why evidence-based rather than hearsay? And then you step back to the paragraph before that, where you speak about how truth is verifiable and establishable. And then you go back to Peter Vardy's comment on truth and how it's costly, and you got to suffer long for truth and that sort of thing. So really you're backwards engineering the essay from the key point you're wanting to end up with, which is phonetic awareness, early childhood, evidence, which is your practice. And then you're looking at the theory that comes from this subject, which says that the way we understand critical thinking teaches us that we don't just go with our gut feeling, and we don't just go with what the parents say, and we don't always go with just what the board says. We actually have another approach to truth. This then becomes slightly challenging in that we are Christians. And sometimes we may have a gut level, and we may pray, and we have this sense that God's Spirit or the Holy Spirit or Jesus says to us. That student seems to have a bit of a struggle there. And I was going to classify that student as bottom level, struggling, and I was going to classify the other student as top level, advanced. But if you feel the nudge of God's Holy Spirit, how does that fit in a modern scientific evidence-based approach? And we would say, from the class that we do on Christian approaches and other cultures, that there is an awareness that there could be Holy Spirit revelations and so on. And I think the answer is to balance both. If Holy Spirit gut level is telling you something that's totally contrary to evidence-based, then we've got an issue. But if you can work with both, so I was thinking of labeling this student bottom level, but the Holy Spirit's nudging me. I think I'll talk to some other teachers. There's some issues with family. There's some issues with health, issues with hearing, issues with eyesight. Then maybe I shouldn't be rushing into the evidence-based, which is not considering everything that's involved. And so that's what we're doing in weeks 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We're moving away from the purely scientific, which we look at in the first few weeks, and we are considering these other levels of thinking as well in the other weeks that follow. So weeks 5, mathematical, week 6, scientific. And then we start to think, but what about storytelling? What about emotions? What about ethics? What about cultures and difference? What about the way groups that we're a part of shape the way we're thinking? And you said that well before about how groups and cultures shape us as well. Other questions about assignment 2 in particular? Beck, do you have thoughts on what you might focus on in assignment 2? And then if you reverse engineer it back to the question of truth, and then does Evelyn or Beth or others have thoughts or questions? No, Beck doesn't. What about Beth? Any thoughts on what you might focus on?
I think I liked how you mentioned about like the phonic awareness and early childhood. I guess that still fits in with my year level, and I think that would be really interesting to have a look at. I'm still trying to get my head around how to do the assignment.
Yeah.
But
So you could do your research focused on that, couldn't you? As that could be the focal area, that the point you're wanting to hit about 2/3 of the way through your assignment, and then you'd introduce that in your introduction as well. But before you get to that, we're wanting to say other things that are important in this subject and essay. We're looking for truth about the areas that we teach. We're looking for evidence-based about the areas we teach, based on scientific method. And when we do the week on scientific method, we'll see that the scientific method didn't just arrive overnight. Aristotle tried to develop the scientific method, and when he went to his teacher Plato and said, we need to observe things, and his teacher Plato said, hang on, Aristotle, the unseen is more important than the seen. Have you noticed that in mathematics, you can't see the numbers, but they're important? And Aristotle said, humdrum, I don't believe in mathematics. You know, people say 2 + 2, but I say, take the objects, look at them. You can't just have these invisible things called maths, said Aristotle. And then Plato said, but what about the sense of order that is there? Doesn't that point to the gods and the divine? Shouldn't we consider that? And Aristotle would say, oh, I don't know about all this invisible stuff. Just give me what I can observe, said Aristotle. And so you got this tension between the observable, which is the modernist, and the non-observable. And Aristotle and Plato were wrestling with this 400 BC, 300 BC. And we're still wrestling with that today. Philosophers, you've got some philosophers out there that are materialists and say, if you want to describe a house, you pick up the bricks that the house is made of and break off a piece and analyze the clay that was used. And if you tell me the chemical composition of the clay, then you've told me what a house is. And the sociologist comes along and says, there's a family in that house and they relate in a certain way. And there's an economist will come along and say there's economics about building the house and how it works. And the council will come along and say we've got to supply water. So there's complexities to truth. But the materialist says, hey, a house is just bits of clay. You know, what's all of this invisible stuff? and then a lot of philosophers tend to be caught up with the invisible because that's where the interesting stuff happens. And then theologians and Christians say it's all about the invisible as well, because that's where interesting things happen. The material's important. We need our chemists and people who make clay bricks, but we also need to understand the invisible. So we start to think one way of looking at the invisible is simply to tell a story. You know, this house was perceived in the mind of a dreamer, a mum and a dad, So you can tell a story about how things unfold. And the Bible has quite a lot of storytelling in it, and First Nations culture has storytelling in it. It's another way of doing truth, isn't it? And then we go on to emotions, and a lot of we have biases according to our emotions. And then we go on to ethics, and then we go on to cultural ways of thinking, and then we go on to group thinking. So if you're amongst a group of chemists, then everything's described in terms of chemistry. Or if you're among a group of engineers, then everything's described in terms of engineering. And if you're amongst a group of psychologists, everything's described in terms of psychology. So whichever group you're in determines how you describe truth. And then, yeah, so there's some of the things we wrestle with, which all comes back to we're looking at how you describe truth. I love that idea. We all have our own truth, but then none of us have our own truth. We're all brought up in societies and cultures and worldviews in which truth is handed to us, but we take responsibility. We make decisions about which truths we accept and which truths we run with. I love existentialists. Has anyone come across existentialists like Soren Kierkegaard? Anyone come across existentialists like Soren Kierkegaard? So rather than looking at truth as it's presented to us in science, Soren Kierkegaard said this is really quite dangerous. He said, you need to take responsibility for your truth and how you work it out. It's what you do with life that is more important than what's presented to you. So real truth is based on not just facts, but what we actually do with it. It's not objective, that is, we measure it and describe it. It's subjective. It's the actions that we do as a result of what's going on. The fact alone is not as important as the actions that flow from it. So Soren Kierkegaard turns the whole discussion of truth around, saying, because a lot of scientists would say what you can measure, observe, weigh, that's truth. Soren Kierkegaard says the opposite. He says what you do and act on, and that is real truth. It's your actions. And so, yeah, I think it's quite amazing sort of concept that Kierkegaard would say truth is not about facts, it's about the leap of faith that you take. And certainly the facts can guide you a bit, but it's when you take that leap of faith that determines what's going to unfold, and that's where the real truth is. So with IQ, you could give an IQ test at the beginning of the year and say, these are the low ability students, and so I'm going to put them in this group. These are the high ability students, I'll put them in this other group. But Kierkegaard would say, hey, we need to take a leap of faith, and maybe every student could do well. Maybe we could work with them all as though they're all able to be brilliant and do well. So Kierkegaard is very much about these leaps of faith rather than just simply following the facts. So that seems a bit counterintuitive. Evelyn, what do you think of Kierkegaard's brave, counterintuitive approach to truth? It's not just following facts, but it's taking leaps of faith into the dark.
Well, I do admit I'm not super familiar with his work. The only stuff I know about it is what you just told me. So I might be quite ignorant, but I'm not a big fan, I'm going to be honest. I feel like truth, is what corresponds with reality. So I feel like truth in and of itself has to be objective. Otherwise, it's not truth. So
Good,
I'm sure
good.
he's done a lot more thinking about this, hopefully, but yeah,
Yeah,
based on
yeah,
what I know, I'm gonna have to
yeah, yeah.
disagree.
Yeah, love it, love it. And there's plenty of people who would be on your side. And if I go into a hospital, there'll be lots of people on your side. Tara, your thoughts on Kierkegaard's idea of don't just follow the facts and what's observable, but take some leaps of faith. Your thoughts, Tara?
I did faith and purpose over the summer semester, and so James Sire talks a lot about how our worldview is not simply what we think, it's what we do. And so I think our reality, or at least our truth, can very much be less about what we say or we project, and more about our actions and what they say. So I do think that there is this element of subjectivity or action involved with truth, for sure. But I agree with Evelyn in that I think for something to be true, then it must be anchored in reality somewhere. So
We find that in Christian thought as well, in that a lot of people have been keen to strongly argue. We know there was a Moses people who moved across into the promised land and they wrote, say, the Ten Commandments. We know that there is truth in the Ten Commandments. We know that one of the commandments, at least, is a bit cultural. And so the Sabbath commandment has absolute truths. You need to rest. You need to rest for about 8 hours a day. And you also need to rest probably one day in 7. And it's good also to have a Sabbath rest. And so there's absolute truths in the Sabbath commandment, which you can observe and measure. And there's even talk that if we get people to work 6 hours a day, they may actually get more done than 8 hours a day. And so this idea of increasing rest can actually increase performance is worth studying. And yet there are cultural elements. Do you choose Saturday as your day of rest and so on? So I guess there's a lot of cultural elements. Actually, every one of the 10 Commandments might have a cultural element to it. Thou shalt not kill is the absolute, but then what about punishment and so on? So there could be, and warfare. So there could be cultural aspects of these. So I like what you say, Tara, in that we need to balance both the modernist view and also Soren Kierkegaard's subjective existentialist faith view there as well. Interestingly, Peter Harrison, and I'm a big fan of Peter Harrison, when he did a study of the origins of science, he found that one of the things that was puzzling is that the people who came up with science, like Copernicus and others, were often not anti-religious, they were often religious. And so the question is, why does Christian faith and Protestant faith contribute to science? And that is because there's quite a bit in Old Testament approach to observation and truth that actually influence people to pursue the development of an approach called science. And the sense of order in the world was one of those things. And even when you look at Leonardo da Vinci, he talks about the sense of order in the world. You look at Isaac Newton, he talks about the sense of order in the world. And so this sense of order in the world leads to this scientific observing. And they spoke about God has called us not only to read the Bible and know the laws of God, but also to read the natural world and the book of nature and know what are the laws of gravity and the laws of the world. It's part of that responsibility. Peter Harrison also then looked at something else interesting, is that many of those in the 1700s who were scientists warned of sin and warned of the idea of sin and Adam and Eve. That would lead to corruption. And so we'd need verifiable, testable results, evidence-based results. And again, it partly comes from this Christian motivation to find truth. And so a lot of the first universities were established by Christian motivation. A lot of the scientific breakthroughs of the 1700s were established by Christian motivation. And there's still somewhat of that flows through. However, in the 1850s through to the 1920s and even up to our own time, this has faded away, in that people have tended to now simply say the laws of nature, even though there could be a God who establishes them, there's a bit of a fade away. Although, interestingly, the majority of people in the USA still believe in God, following God. Many countries that have become scientific, like South Korea, have a high level of belief in God. So there is an alignment between Christian belief and the scientific belief, which fits, Tara, with what you were saying, that truth is not just about what we do, it's also about thinking and evidence-based, but it's also about what we do as well. Any further thoughts, Tara? And then Beth? No, Beth, do you have any thoughts on Soren Kierkegaard's idea of truth is about faith? And we're studying right here at the beginning, truth is about evidence and what we can observe.
Yeah, I liked Tara's comments before about how, truth, I guess for truth, if you believe something, say, I don't know, do not murder, you're not going to, in your conscience, you don't go out and do it. So there is a bit of that overlap as what you believe is what you do. A bit like how Jesus was like, it's about your motivations of your heart and what you believe, because that obviously is the practical, sort of working out of who you are, I guess. But also it's hard to I think we like something, especially maybe in our Western world, where we like something to look at and see and touch and be like, okay, that's true because I can see it. So I think, I'm wrestling between both. This I guess the spiritual and the practical, and I'm sort of getting my head around it.
And in assignment 2, you're asked to do some reflection. And it's very important as a teacher to develop skills in reflection. And as Socrates said, it's important that you know yourself. And so it's important to identify what's your church background, how has that influenced you, what have been your other experiences in the life journey. And there'll be experiences possibly where you'll see miracles and answers to prayer. And then there'll be other experiences where you may not quite see things work out the same way. And you've got to sort of wrestle that through as to what is truth. For me, the answer is a bit like looking at parents and children. That is, I discover God is a little bit like a parent, in that I would love God to come and sit in the seat next to me in year 3 primary and year 4 primary and give me all the maths answers. I mean, why do I have to do maths in year 3 and 4 when God can give me the answers? Or if he doesn't, Google can perhaps. But the reality of the life journey is, it was a week or 2 ago, I got a flat tire. And I mean, why does God allow flat tires? And you had to work through the process, and there were little miracles. The RAC came along and they helped me change it. And so I think life is full of little miracles, and life is full of a lot of scientific evidence, and we've got to balance that through together with relationality. We've got to learn how to relate, and all of that's part of working through what we do. But so in assignment 2, I suggest you pick an area that you are very interested in your teaching, such as classroom management or phonic awareness, or what the key to your teaching is, and then think back, why do I believe that is true? And then you work back to truth and those areas. Of course, in assignment 2, you also have to look at your own worldview. So you've got to look at your own worldview, and you got to write a little bit about how you've developed your ideas of truth. So reflect on the various influences that form your own personal worldview, and this could be church upbringing. And I think most of us find that there are times when our upbringing leads us to understand more mystical associations of truth. And then there are times when we get very down to earth associations of truth. Tara, do you have sort of times where you've had sort of more Christian mystical approaches to truth, and other times where you've had come down to earth and gone with a more scientific, measure it, observable? And then speak up, anyone else, or put your hand up if you've got other thoughts too. Yeah.
Oh, that's a tricky one. I think probably in my approach to parenting, it's been a balance. So, as much as we'd hit a new milestone and we'd run into new behavioral issues or so forth, and I'd be praying about it, at the same time, I'd be reaching for a book by one of my favorite parenting authors and working out strategies and tips and applying sort of a practical approach to how to deal with whatever's going on, or trying to understand the brain chemistry or the development side of things. But yes, in the background, I'm also, this is a little human created in the image of God, and I'm praying into the spiritual realm about what's going on as well. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of a personal balance of what's true and how to approach that.
And I think that's a very real and healthy approach, is that as Christians, we believe in prayer and dialogue with God. But as Christians, we also believe that God has given otherwise people who've written books that have been put there as resources for us to engage with. And there can be books on brain chemistry and neuroscience, and over 200 years, 400 years, there've been these insights. And as a responsible parent or teacher, it's my responsibility to keep up to date with those resources. And then there's also relationality. That is, it's important that I relate to other parents, other teachers, other experts where I can, and I'm open to their input. It's important that I develop a certain level of humility, so I don't think I've just got all the answers that they come in. But I balance humility with a certain measure of bravery and a bit of heroic attitude as well. So you balance all those things together, don't you, as you go forward. So there's some of the things that you cover in assignment 2 when you reflect on your own personal worldview. Now, I suggest that you might want to write 2 or 3 pages on this and then edit it down to 1 or 2 paragraphs. So you could write about your journey and what's influenced you, and that'll be a valuable little resource you can reflect on. And then you might want to edit it down to 1 or 2 paragraphs. And then if you want to really boost it, you could add Google Scholar, family influences on worldviews. And so if you went to Google Scholar and typed in family influences on worldviews, you could find some scholarly references on that you could put in there as well, and that would make it look very scholarly. And so that would give it a lift as well. So as we go down Google Scholar, these ones don't have any references on the right, so they won't let me find it. But we've got here student and parental perceptions, parental influences on worldview. So it'll let me open that up. And before I open that up, I can cut and paste. If I go here, Control C, I've got a copy of that. I can paste that reference into my Word document. And so I've got the reference, and then I can go to the resource and I can read that and just take a few ideas, put it into my personal reflection on family influences. And I've got some scholarly material there. So Robert Davis wrote a PhD, College of Education, and he included some material on family influences. And so I could use some of that insight there. He's got an abstract at the beginning where he briefly looks at it, and then we could just get a couple of thoughts out of that, and that would be that would lift the scholarly level of what we're doing in our second assignment. And similarly, in your forum posts, it won't make a lot of difference. People will get a similar result in that you'll get out of your forum posts, you'll get a assessment mark, but you can lift it a little bit higher by digging a bit deeper, and then you collate them all and put them all together. And so when you put those assessment items up in your forum posts, you can always add a bit of depth to it if you want to add some scholarly depth to your forum post. So if we go down to the forum post down here with week 1, and then if we just quickly have a look at some of these examples. So if we gave you a mark of sort of, so I think the forum posts add up to about 20%. And so if you do 10 of them, they're worth about 2% each. So, so here's a nice little discussion of the article and what's covered. And so that would then get you at least 1 out of 2%. And you may even get 1.5 out of 2%. But to get that extra mark, then you might want to add a bit more depth, interact with an extra resource or two, and add a scholarly resource. So that would just, if you want to get some extra marks there, doesn't make a huge difference, but it can add some resources. And so just some examples there, just gives you a little bit of general feedback. So the briefer comments will probably get the 1 out of 2, but the longer analysis and some references might give you more marks there. So worth keeping that in mind. Yeah. So let's see if this one's, so this one here, we've got a bit more written, interacting with a bit more resources, and we've got a reference list on here. So that would get 1.5 out of 2, maybe up towards 2 out of 2, because they've done a bit more on the forum post. We don't want you to spend a lot of time on it, but just giving you the heads up if you're worried about picking up an extra 1 mark here, 1 mark there. Any questions about that, about the forum posts? Yes, Tara.
Sorry, trying to unmute myself. This one's not actually about the forum post, but it is about the assessment. I was just wondering, I know that we're not supposed to generally refer to ourselves in the first person, but obviously with our essay, when we're talking about our own personal worldview, there is going to be some sort of reference to the author or that sort of thing. Are you happy with us to use nouns like I, or would you prefer us to refer to ourselves in the third person, or do you have a preference?
I think it's worth watching out for the danger of the first person. And so when you write your 2 or 3 pages, you could write, I think that. And then when you put it into the essay itself, you could put, you could have a sentence or so in the first person. You're probably wise to avoid the first person. And you could even write, the author of this essay is of the view that. And that would, and in my personal journey, I reflected on, I felt that. The danger with the first person is that it's hard to avoid the emotive. It's hard to avoid the non-evidence based. But at the same time, Soren Kierkegaard would say, it's probably good to have some first person to take ownership for your thoughts. And so we have this tension between we are marking you objectively using scientific methods, but it's important for you to take ownership of your views and responsibility for them. So I think the safest thing is to avoid the first person to some extent, but then journal in the first person and say, I felt that. You know, I was disappointed this week in my teaching when someone said such and such. I felt terrible. You know, the first person is very useful. But when you send your email off, you know, I was disappointed when you said this. I felt terrible. What do you think you're doing making me so angry? Probably delete all of that and just write, thank you for raising some concerns. They are important for my development. I will attend to them. Will be a much better response, and just keep all the personal stuff for yourself and your friend, the teacher in the room next door. But as long as they don't mind you complaining too much. Yes. Any other questions as we draw together some of the thoughts for tonight? So we've briefly introduced the sorts of ideas we're covering. Yes, Evelyn.
Do you have an estimated amount of time we should be spending on the forum posts each week?
Yes, so we estimate that you should put in 10 hours per week on each subject that you study. So you're doing 4 subjects, Evelyn?
Yes, I am. But
So if you do, yep.
I've just noticed that the forum posts, I do spend a bit of time on it, and I'm just wondering if it's something.
Yeah. So you've got to find a way not to spend too much time on it. So if you spend 10 hours a week on each subject, then I would suggest that you should be spending maybe half of the time for this subject on assignment 2 and assignment 3, in that they give you the most marks, and assignment 3 gives you the most marks, but assignment 2 gives you almost that many marks. So the forum posts won't give you the sort of marks that you want. Now, the other 5 hours you should spend on the class material. And so if you come along to a class, then that's 1 hour. If you watch a video, that could be another hour. And so you've then only got sort of 3 hours left for your class time. And that really only leaves you about an hour or so for your forum posts. So you don't have a lot of time allocated to the forum posts. So I think the secret is to do a bit of a skim read on the forum post. So you'd go to the, read it through for half an hour or so, and then chase it up. So we've got, thinking about critical thinking. You might want to give half an hour or so to reading that. And then there's other things to read. So you've only got sort of 3 or 4 hours, 5 hours at the maximum total to work your way through it. Now, hopefully some of this is so interesting that you want to read a bit more. And if you can journal a bit, and if it helps your personal growth and development, then I think that's worth that little bit of extra time. So if it's personal development, personal growth, then I think then it's probably better than watching a TV soapy or another movie or something like that, in that it's part of your general recreation time rather than the full study time. And then the writing up of it, you're going to get the 1 out of 2 points if you put together some nice thoughts and hand it in, but you don't have time to do much editing. But you could quickly put a Google Scholar reference in, or you could quickly explore something extra. But you'd probably be better to do that in assignment 2 and assignment 3, in that that's probably going to grow you and develop you more. And it's also going to give you more grades, and it's given more grades because that's what's going to grow and develop you more. But at the same time, you want to just pick up on the key ideas each week that are covered. So certainly you want to spend at least half an hour or so looking at the resources, looking at the material that's covered each week, and then as you look at each topic each week, and I usually collect some rough notes. I would probably write a 1-page outline of what's covered each week, and then some of it I would just cut and paste some material. So I'd cut and paste some thoughts on what is critical thinking, and I'd be thinking I'm going to use this anyway in my assignment. I probably wouldn't reference the video, Sam Hay and Daniel Carrigy. I'd watch it, and then if there was a bit that was a bit slow, I'd jump 10 minutes ahead to try and get through it a bit more. And then the optional videos, if they're much the same, wouldn't necessarily jump there. But if you had interest in some of them, then you could explore those under the additional resources. Certainly the diagram can be useful in that it shows some of the difference between the fields of knowledge and ways of knowing. So the fields of knowledge are really the subjects like maths and science and literacy. And then the ways of knowing are counting and then observing and evidence base. So they're very related, the fields and ways of knowing. And then knowledge is one area that we're working with. But knowledge can also be socially influenced and culturally influenced. And then metaphysics is all the invisible stuff. And that's the fascinating thing. I mean, what makes a house? It's not the knowledge we have of the bricks. It's family and all the other stuff that makes a home and a house, and God, who is the good, who brings order into the world, and we can talk to Father God. And then values are also important. So that's an important one that I'd probably save the diagram, think about the diagram slightly. There's a PowerPoint slide. I may have a glance at that, and other resources there. Tutorial questions we probably won't have a lot of time to look at, but if you want some stimulus ideas, the word metacognition is one that you could possibly, you see that there and you think, wow, I should think about metacognition and what is it? And so you could quickly make a note of that when you see. So it's thinking about thinking and understanding what is there behind thinking. And then Google, fortunately, these days says that there are pre-planning our thinking, monitoring our thinking, reviewing our thinking. So I think there's some great insights there. And I could go to what Cambridge International has said about that. And I could put into Google Scholar if I wanted something more scholarly there as well. So does that help answer your question, Evelyn? You really have this fairly tight schedule of 10 hours a week for each subject. And unfortunately, that adds up to 40 hours a week if you're doing 4 subjects. But we've tried to make it a bit flexible with these online Zoom classes so that you can flex them about a little bit so that you can choose times that fit in with other things. Are you working at all to earn $1, Evelyn?
Pardon? Am I what? Sorry.
Working to earn some money.
Oh, yes, I am.
How many hours?
Well, it's with the teacher training program. I mean, it's one full day,
Good.
and then I have a few side hustles. So,
Wow,
yeah.
that's good. So again, you've got to take them off a little bit, and then you got exercise and socialization, and you got your 8 hours sleep. So there's a lot of things you've got to fit in to these studies. But hopefully that model of 10 hours, of which half of the 10 hours into your assignments, such as assignment 2 and 3, is helpful. And then you want to put it 3 to 5 hours into going through the subject material, which would include that forum post. And yeah. Any other questions similar to Evelyn's, or any other questions?
Sorry,
Right.
Dr. Hay, can I just ask, last week's lecture that I missed, is that the lecture notes in week 3?
Yes. So we've got the
Okay.
lecture. So the lecture notes and the Sam Hay and Daniel Carnegie tend to
Yeah.
be the prepared notes for each week, and they're better prepared than these chat classes that we're doing at the moment.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And certainly if you have any questions, feel free, you can send them through. If you want to send through just a one paragraph, this is what I'm thinking of doing in my assignment 2 or assignment 3. I would encourage you to read through the question a couple of times and think, what's the major thing that's being focused on here? Read through the topics that we're covering. If you want to send through a draft assignment, if this is your first 1, 2, or 3 subjects that you're studying and you want to send a draft assignment through, sometimes it's better to get the feedback before you hand it in than after you hand it in. It really depends on what you're going to read most carefully. And some people who don't read after they've handed it in, they would read more before they handed it in. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? So if there's no other questions, can I pray for you as we draw to a close? And then if you have any questions after I pray, then that's fine too. Heavenly Father, we do thank you that you care for us and you teach us in many ways. We thank you for the many ways of learning that we're learning about in this subject, such as wisdom, that's a bit like this rich heritage that's been handed down to us by modern, objective, scientific thinkers, but also the other ways of thinking that have been handed down by those who pray, those who worship, those who are more intuitive, those who are relational, those who come from other cultures. Lord, we pray, help us to be more sensitive to different ways of knowing and understanding in order that we might be better prepared in our teaching and our work and our lives. Amen. So if there's no final questions, a big thank you for coming along tonight. I'm sure this will give you some insights. Just briefly, if we could go through what's something that stood out or that you've appreciated tonight. Say Beth first, something that stood out and appreciated, and then Tara, Evelyn, Beck, and Kerry Lee. Beth, what stood out to you? What have you appreciated?
Well, I really appreciated you going over assessment 2 because I had a look at it and I had no idea where to start. So I feel like I've got a few things that I can think about now and start, collecting some stuff. So direction for that was something, fun.
And especially I've tried to give some ideas of how to connect it to practical, everyday teaching in a classroom setting. And so hopefully that really helps to tie it in there as well as the general concepts that we're teaching here. Tara, what stood out to you today?
I love just talking about that idea of truth together and all the different areas that truth comes from. And just I love that you challenged us to take ownership over our personal truth and where that comes from and what we believe. So that was great.
And that idea of accountability is so important for our students as well as, when a student gets annoyed by a student next to them, what is it that's annoying them? Have you thought through the various causes? How do you know and understand? And all of that can be very helpful, getting students to take responsibility, be accountable, be fully aware. Evelyn, what stood out tonight?
Well, I just found at the end there the practical breakdown of how we should be using our time in the classes was helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. That's so good. And also you can draw up a weekly calendar and a monthly calendar, and you can look at all the other things that are competing for your time. And you can put on that the due dates when assignments are due, and you can aim a week beforehand to have the assignment completed. So there's some other time planning strategies that you can bring in and seek to balance your time. Beck, what stood out to you? And then Kerry Lee.
Definitely the assignment 2 breakdown. That's given me kind of a better window of where I was going to go and where I'm going to go now. And I think the discussion thread, how you've given us an idea of if we want to get a bit more better mark, you've given us a guide to what we can do to just better it that little bit more, tweak it for better mark. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think if you always go to a strong scholarly resource like Google Scholar, and then just take 5 minutes to read a resource or two from Google Scholar on the topic and find out a bit more about concepts and ideas, and then you introduce that even in something small like a forum or in a paragraph of your assignment, it helps grow you as a scholarly thinker, and it helps grow your piece of writing, and that's useful as well. And Kerry Lee, what stood out to you?
I think basically just your breakdown of the whole course, and how it's ties in, and all the different aspects of what we're going to be learning, how that ties into our assessments, and just also going through breaking down assessment 2 and 3 was really helpful. Thank you.
And as we say in the course, we focus on the more scientific, modernist approaches early, and then we move to some of the broader ways that are found in a wide variety of cultures, such as storytelling and spirituality, and those various other ways as well. And so, yeah, we cover all these different approaches. So good. So look forward to seeing you in 7 days' time. Usual time and time slot, and we're moving on to week 4, which is the historical perspectives, where we see that through time, great thinkers through history have some insights, and then even our views of history change every 10 years, every 100 years. People seem to have a different view. They're living in a different cultural setting. We'll look at some of those effects on the way in which truth is situated. And that leads us to the observation that we live in this 2020s postmodern world where we're all on screens, and we can all create our own narrative. And so there's a whole discussion that's flowed now out of postmodernism and ways we view the world, which is quite different to the 1960s and 70s when we thought we lived in the modern world. If we live in a postmodern world that's shaped by how you feel about truth or whatever. But anyway, that's a sidetrack if you wanted to pursue it. All right. See you next week, 7 days' time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.